Judge Richard Crawford drums his fingers on his mahogany bench, scanning the morning's docket with weary eyes. A coffee stain darkens his crisp white sleeve, the result of a near collision with a clerk rushing past him earlier. He'd snapped at her, his irritation from a weekend argument, with his daughter still simmering beneath the surface. The courtroom fills steadily, the familiar morning buzz setting in. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the room as Crawford adjusts his reading glasses. 23 cases today, mostly traffic violations, a few minor disputes, and the usual Monday morning parade of weekend infractions. He glances at his watch. 9:15 a.m. His daughter Sarah's words from their argument echo in his mind. "You never listen, Dad. You just wait for your turn to speak." The first few cases move through like clockwork. Crawford prides himself on efficiency, on keeping the municipal court running like a well-oiled machine. A young man stammers through an explanation for running a red light. A middle-aged woman pleads for leniency on a speeding ticket, citing her clean driving record. Crawford dispenses judgments with practiced precision, barely looking up from his papers. Between cases, his eyes drift to the small silver frame on his bench, hidden from public view. His late wife, Catherine, smiles back at him, a reminder of gentler days. She'd always been his moral compass, especially in moments when his temper threatened to get the best of him. "Everyone has a story worth hearing, Rich," she used to say. The coffee stain on his sleeve catches his attention again, and he feels a twinge of guilt about how he treated the clerk earlier. The bailiff calls the next case, and Crawford notices Officer Peterson entering the courtroom. The officer's presence is as familiar as the morning sun, always punctual, always prepared. They exchange quick nods, a ritual born from 15 years of shared courthouse mornings. Peterson takes his usual spot, thumbing through his citation book with practiced ease. Crawford's attention drifts momentarily to the window, where autumn leaves dance past in the morning breeze. His daughter's graduation ceremony is next month, and she hasn't confirmed whether she wants him there. The thought sits heavy in his chest, a weight he carries beneath his judicial robe. The courthouse clock ticks steadily overhead, its rhythm matching the predictable flow of justice below. Crawford signs another judgment, his pen scratching against paper with perhaps more force than necessary. The coffee in his cup has grown cold, forgotten in the steady stream of cases. A small commotion at the back of the courtroom draws his attention. A woman in a navy suit speaks quietly but intensely with her counsel, papers spread between them on the last row of benches. Something about her composure catches Crawford's eye, but he pushes the observation aside. "Stay focused," he tells himself. "Keep the docket moving." The morning sun climbs higher, sending sharp rectangles of light across the courtroom floor. Crawford feels the familiar weight of authority settling around his shoulders like a comfortable old coat. This is his domain, his carefully ordered world where justice flows according to precedent and procedure. He straightens his papers, clears his throat, and nods to the bailiff to call the next case. Little does he know that in less than an hour, this carefully maintained order will face its greatest challenge, and the foundations of his judicial worldview will begin to crack. Dr. Patricia Washington strides into the courtroom precisely at 9:45 a.m., the quiet confidence in her steps matched by the meticulous organization of the folder she carries. Her navy suit catches the fluorescent light as she approaches the podium, a stark contrast to the worn wooden barriers separating the gallery from the proceedings. She spent 20 years in courtrooms across the state, but today she's here for herself. The parking ticket rests on top of her documents, a seemingly trivial matter that she'd normally pay without question. But this isn't about the $75. It's about principle, about a broken meter and a system that needs to acknowledge its mistakes. She documented everything. Time-stamped photos of the malfunctioning display, maintenance records obtained through a formal request, even statements from 2 shop owners about the meter's persistent issues. Judge Crawford barely glances up as the bailiff calls her case. He's already reaching for his gavel, muscle memory from thousands of similar moments. The weight of the day's earlier cases hangs in the air. Quick judgments, interrupted explanations, the steady march of efficiency over understanding. Your Honor, Dr. Washington begins, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone well-versed in courtroom protocol. She starts to explain about the documented malfunction, but Crawford's hand rises in that familiar dismissive wave she's seen countless times from behind the bar, though never as its target. The citation clearly states you were parked for 45 minutes in a 30-minute zone. Crawford interrupts, his voice carrying the weariness of 100 similar excuses heard that morning. Do you dispute being parked there? Your Honor, if I may explain. Dr. Washington maintains her composure, trying again to reference the documentation she's prepared. A young law clerk in the corner catches her eye, offering a sympathetic glance. She's seen that look before, usually from her own staff, when observing particularly difficult judges. Crawford cuts through her words again, his attention already drifting to the next case on his docket. A simple yes or no will suffice, ma'am. Were you parked in that spot for 45 minutes? The room temperature seems to drop a few degrees. Dr. Washington feels the familiar weight of this moment, one she's discussed countless times in diversity panels and bar association meetings. The assumptions, the dismissals, the subtle and not so subtle ways the system reveals its biases. She straightens her spine, remembering the advice she'd given just last week to a group of young black law students. Your presence in these spaces matters. Your voice matters, even when they try to silence you. Your Honor, she tries one final time, her voice taking on the same tone she uses when addressing the state Supreme Court. The meter in question was documented as malfunctioning by the city's own maintenance department. I have here. Ms. Washington. Crawford interrupts again, emphasizing the incorrect honorific. This court's time is valuable. The fact remains that your vehicle was parked beyond the posted limit. If you have an issue with the meter, you can take it up with the city maintenance department. In the gallery, a few regular courthouse observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. They've seen this scene play out before, but something feels different this time. The air grows thick with unspoken words as Dr. Washington calmly opens her folder, her fingertips resting on a business card that could change the entire dynamic of this interaction. The air grows thick with unspoken words as Judge Crawford pronounces the maximum fine of $200. A slight tremor in Dr. Washington's hand betrays her frustration as she grips the podium, her knuckles whitening against the worn wood. The young public defender in the corner shifts uncomfortably, recognizing the familiar pattern but powerless to intervene. Dr. Washington takes a measured breath, her heart pounding against her ribs despite her outward calm. 20 years of legal practice taught her to choose her battles carefully. This moment, she decides, will be one of them. The courthouse clock ticks, loudly in the sudden silence, marking each second of the growing tension. Your Honor, she speaks with deliberate precision. I request permission to make a statement for the record regarding the proceedings today. Her voice carries to every corner of the courtroom, drawing the attention of the clerks who had been mechanically processing paperwork, their heads rising in unison at her tone. Crawford's hand pauses midway to his gavel. Something in her voice, perhaps its careful control, or maybe its underlying steel, makes him hesitate. He peers over his reading glasses, really looking at her for the first time since she entered his courtroom. The matter has been decided, he replies, but uncertainty creeps into his voice. The routine script suddenly feels inadequate. If you wish to appeal. With all due respect, Your Honor, Dr. Washington interrupts, causing a few gasps from the gallery. The issue isn't just about the fine. It's about due process and the right to present evidence in one's defense. She maintains steady eye contact with Crawford, her posture radiating a quiet authority that seems to grow with each word. Officer Peterson, still standing near the bailiff's station, closes his citation book. In 15 years, he's never seen anyone command the courtroom quite like this. The morning sunlight streaming through the high windows casts Dr. Washington's shadow long across the floor, reaching almost to the judge's bench. Crawford feels sweat forming at his collar. The coffee stain on his sleeve suddenly feels like a spotlight on his imperfections. "Ms. Washington," he begins, falling back on formality. "This is a simple parking violation. We have a full docket." "Doctor," she corrects him quietly but firmly. "And what we have here is a fundamental question of judicial conduct." The folder in her hands remains unopened, but her fingers rest on its edge like a chess player's hand hovering over a decisive piece. The bailiff takes a half step forward, then stops, unsure of the protocol in this increasingly unusual situation. The routine of the municipal court has been disrupted, and the air crackles with possibility. Crawford glances at his computer screen, a new wariness in his expression. Something about her name tugs at his memory, but he can't quite place it. His cursor hovers over the case file, tempted to look deeper than the surface details he dismissed earlier. "You have 1 minute," he concedes, trying to maintain control of his courtroom, while acknowledging the growing sense that he might have miscalculated. The words come out gruffer than intended, a defensive reflex against his rising uncertainty. Dr. Washington nods once, opening her folder with deliberate slowness. The rustling of papers echoes in the silent courtroom as she withdraws a single business card. In this moment of suspended animation, before she speaks her next words, the power dynamic in the room begins its seismic shift. Time seems to freeze as Dr. Washington's words float through the air. "As the newly appointed head of the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee, I find myself particularly concerned with today's proceedings." Judge Crawford's coffee cup halts midway to his lips, the ceramic suddenly feeling fragile in his grasp. The recognition hits him in waves. First, the keynote speech at last month's State Bar Conference, the passionate address about modernizing judicial conduct standards that had half the audience on their feet. Then her photograph in the Bar Journal, centered on page 1 beneath the headline, "Groundbreaking Appointment Signals Change." Finally, the email he'd skimmed just yesterday about upcoming ethics reviews, signed with her name and credentials. The coffee cup makes it back to his desk with a soft clink that seems to echo through the stunned courtroom. A drop of brown liquid escapes, joining the earlier stain on his sleeve like a spreading ink blot of embarrassment. In the gallery, phones remain frozen halfway through their usual surreptitious texting motions. The court reporter's fingers hover over her stenotype, capturing this moment of suspended animation. Even Officer Peterson has abandoned his usual stance of casual authority, looking between the judge and Dr. Washington with undisguised interest. Crawford's mind races through the previous 15 minutes. Every interruption, every dismissive gesture, every moment he'd chosen efficiency over dignity. His daughter's words from their weekend argument resurface with painful clarity. "You never listen, Dad. You just assume you know better than everyone else." Dr. Washington maintains her position at the podium, her posture neither aggressive nor submissive. She's handled countless similar situations throughout her career, but this one feels different. It's not just about her anymore. It's about every person who stood where she stands, waiting to be heard. "I believe," she continues into the silence, her voice carrying the weight of both authority and opportunity, "that this presents us with an interesting chance to examine our judicial practices firsthand." The words are carefully chosen, offering a bridge rather than an ultimatum. Crawford's hand moves to his gavel, then retreats, the habitual motion suddenly seeming inadequate. The morning's carefully maintained routine lies in shambles around him, but something new and potentially valuable rises from its ruins. The young law clerk who had watched sympathetically earlier is now frantically scribbling notes, recognizing the historic nature of this moment. In years to come, this scene would be referenced in law school lectures and bar association seminars, but right now it's just two professionals navigating an unexpected collision of roles and responsibilities. "Dr. Washington," Crawford finally speaks, his voice carrying a new note of genuine respect, "perhaps we should review the evidence you've prepared." He removes his reading glasses, polishing them with deliberate care, a gesture that buys him precious seconds to compose his thoughts. The gallery collectively leans forward, witnesses to an uncommon moment of judicial humility. The morning sun has shifted, and the harsh fluorescent lighting seems less severe, as if the courtroom itself is adjusting to this new reality. Dr. Washington begins laying out her documented evidence with methodical precision, but both she and Crawford know that the parking ticket is no longer the real subject of discussion. This has become something larger, a moment of potential transformation in how justice is administered in this courtroom and perhaps beyond. During lunch, Judge Crawford sits alone in his chambers, his turkey sandwich untouched on its paper wrapping. The security footage plays before him, each interruption feeling like a physical blow. He watches himself lean forward aggressively, his face reddening as Dr. Washington attempts to present evidence. The man on the screen becomes a stranger he barely recognizes. His finger hovers over the rewind button again, the fourth time he's watched the interaction. The timestamp reads 9:47 a.m., and he counts the interruptions 1, 2, 3, 7 times in less than 5 minutes. Each time he cut her off, his past self seemed more assured, more righteous. Now, hours later, that certainty feels like a lead weight in his stomach. The half-eaten apple on his desk has turned brown at its exposed edges, much like how he feels his own facade has oxidized under scrutiny. A knock at the door makes him jump, but he doesn't answer. The security footage continues to play, a mirror he can't look away from. On screen, Dr. Washington stands with perfect composure, her credentials hanging in the air like an indictment. Crawford notices details he missed in the moment. The slight tightening of her jaw when he dismissed her as Ms. instead of Doctor. The resigned look shared between two minority members of the gallery. The way his own body language screamed of prejudgment before she'd spoken a single word. His phone buzzes, a text from his daughter. "Dad, can we talk about Sunday?" He puts the phone face down. The parallels are too sharp right now, too cutting. How many times had he interrupted her? Assumed he knew what she was going to say, dismissed her perspective before she could fully express it. The footage reaches its end again. Crawford opens his desk drawer and pulls out the Bar Association journal he barely skimmed last week. Dr. Washington's article on judicial reform stares back at him. He begins reading, really reading this time, his coffee growing cold beside him. Unconscious bias in the courtroom manifests not just in verdicts, he reads, but in the thousand small ways we deny dignity to those seeking justice. The words could have been written about this very morning. His eyes drift to the photo of his late wife, Catherine, on his desk. She would have seen it sooner, would have called him out on his behavior years ago. A notification pops up on his computer. His next session begins in 15 minutes. The afternoon docket waits for no one, not even a judge confronting his own prejudices. But for the first time in 15 years, Crawford questions whether he should be on that bench at all. He stands, walks to his private bathroom, and stares in the mirror. The distinguished gray at his temples, the stern set of his mouth, features he'd always thought conveyed authority and wisdom now seem like a mask, a costume he's worn so long he forgot it wasn't his real face. Back at his desk, he opens his email. The cursor blinks in the empty compose field. An apology seems insufficient, an excuse even worse. What Dr. Washington revealed today wasn't just about one parking ticket or one interrupted testimony. It was about a pattern, a systemic failure personified in his own behavior. He begins typing. "Dear Dr. Washington, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this morning's proceedings in the broader context of judicial reform." He pauses, deletes discuss, and types learn about instead. It's a small change, but it feels like the first step on a very long road. Streetlights cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Judge Crawford pulls file after file from the cabinet. Each case reads like a confession, subtle patterns emerging in his rulings that he'd never noticed before. His phone buzzes repeatedly with messages from his wife about dinner, but he can't tear himself away from the growing pile of evidence before him. The clock on his office wall reads 8:45 p.m. The cleaning staff has already come and gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts and hundreds of case files spread across his desk like tarot cards revealing an uncomfortable future. He's gone back 3 months, tracking his own decisions with the same scrutiny he usually reserves for examining evidence. A pattern emerges in his traffic court rulings. Average fines for white defendants, $120. For minorities, $175. His hands shake as he creates a spreadsheet, documenting each disparity. A similar trend appears in bail hearings. Stricter conditions, higher amounts, fewer personal recognizance releases for defendants of color. The margin of his legal pad fills with tally marks. Times he cut off explanations. Disproportionately women. Extended time granted for additional context. Predominantly older white men. Even his language choices show bias. Sir and Mr. used consistently, while Miss and first names pepper his addresses to women, regardless of their professional status. A janitor's cart squeaks past his door, wheels protesting against the polished floor. Crawford barely notices, absorbed in a particular case from 6 weeks ago. A young black lawyer had requested a continuance, citing a scheduling conflict with another court. Crawford had denied it curtly, noting inadequate planning in his ruling. Just last week, he granted the same request to a white attorney he knew from his country club, writing professional courtesy in the margin. His coffee has gone cold again, but he hardly notices. The screen of his phone lights up with another message. Rich, your dinner's in the microwave. Everything okay? He types a quick response, promising to explain later. How does he tell his wife that everything he thought he knew about himself as a judge, as a person, is unraveling? The fluorescent lights hum overhead as he reaches for another stack of files. A small note falls from between the pages, a request for an interpreter that he dismissed as unnecessary delay. The defendant had eventually pleaded guilty, probably without fully understanding the charges. Crawford feels nauseous. He opens his laptop, navigating to the Judicial Review Board's website. His own record stares back at him. 15 years, no formal complaints. But now he wonders, how many had wanted to complain but feared retaliation? How many had simply accepted his behavior as the unchangeable nature of the system? A moth batters itself against his window, drawn to the light in his office, the only one still burning in the darkened courthouse. Crawford watches it for a moment, thinking about patterns, about repetition, about the difficulty of breaking free from ingrained behaviors. His fingers hover over his keyboard, then begin typing. A letter to the State Bar Association. Not just requesting a meeting with Dr. Washington, but formally volunteering his courtroom for a pilot program in bias monitoring. His cursor blinks at the end of the sentence. I believe my court would provide a compelling case study in how unconscious bias affects judicial decision-making at every level. The moth finally finds a gap in the window frame and escapes into the night. Crawford saves the letter, closes his laptop, and begins gathering the files, not to return them to their cabinet, but to build a case against his own complacency. Tomorrow will be different. It has to be. The State Bar Association's office feels different from Judge Crawford's usual domain. Sitting across from Dr. Washington, his prepared speech dissolves into raw honesty. The morning light streams through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a conference room that feels more like neutral ground than battlefield. I brought something, Crawford says, lifting a heavy accordion file onto the polished table. 3 months of my rulings with patterns I've identified. His hands tremble slightly as he opens it. I spent most of last night analyzing them. The disparities are significant. Dr. Washington leans forward, her expression neutral but attentive. She's had countless meetings like this over her career. Defensive judges trying to explain away their behavior. But something about Crawford's demeanor suggests this might be different. The traffic violations were the most obvious, he continues, spreading out color-coded spreadsheets. But it goes deeper. The language I used, the time I allowed for explanations, even my tone. All of it shows consistent bias. He pauses, swallowing hard. And I never saw it until now. A maintenance worker passes outside the conference room, the squeaking of his cart a reminder of the real world beyond these walls. Dr. Washington picks up one of the spreadsheets, scanning the meticulously documented patterns. Most judges, she says carefully, wouldn't have done this analysis voluntarily. She taps the paper with one manicured nail. And fewer still would have brought it to me. Crawford reaches for his water glass, buying time to steady his voice. Yesterday, my daughter called. We haven't spoken since our argument last weekend. She said she was proud of me, not for being a judge, but for finally being willing to listen. He meets Dr. Washington's gaze. I spent 15 years telling people what justice is, without ever really listening to what it means to them. Dr. Washington pulls out her own folder, thinner than Crawford's, but well-worn. I've been developing a program, she begins, a comprehensive review of judicial conduct, focusing on practical changes rather than just theoretical training. She slides it across the table. I've been looking for a pilot court. Crawford opens the folder, scanning its contents. The proposal is detailed. Regular review of rulings for bias patterns, mandatory diversity training, community feedback sessions, revised guidelines for courtroom conduct. It's everything the system needs, everything he needs. My courtroom is yours, he says without hesitation. But I'd like to suggest one addition. He pulls out another document, the letter he'd written last night. I want to publicly share my own data, the patterns I found, the biases I discovered. No sanitizing, no excuses. Dr. Washington's eyebrows rise slightly, the first clear sign of surprise she's shown. That's unusual, Your Honor. It could have significant implications for your career. Call me Richard, he says quietly. And I know, but maybe that's exactly what the system needs. One judge willing to admit he was wrong, to show others it's possible to change. Outside, the city hums with morning traffic. Inside, two professionals from different worlds begin sketching out a new approach to justice. Dr. Washington pulls out her laptop, and Crawford readies his pen. They work through the morning, building bridges between theory and practice, between past mistakes and future possibilities. As they work, Crawford notices something he'd missed before. The small rainbow pin on Dr. Washington's lapel, the same one his daughter wears. Another conversation he needs to have, another bridge he needs to build. But for now, he focuses on the task at hand, on laying the first stones of a foundation for change. The conference room buzzes with energy as judges from across the state lean forward in their seats. Dr. Washington and Judge Crawford stand side by side at the podium, their 6 months of collaboration evident in their easy synchronization. In the audience, a young judge frantically takes notes, while a veteran judge of 30 years removes his glasses, wiping his eyes. The data speaks for itself, Crawford says, his voice carrying the weight of authenticity. The presentation screen behind him displays stark statistics from his own courtroom, before and after. In the first month alone, we discovered that I was 3 times more likely to interrupt female attorneys. By being conscious of this, we reduced that disparity by 80%. Dr. Washington steps forward, clicking to the next slide. But numbers only tell part of the story, she adds. The real change happened in the human interactions. She gestures to the back of the room, where Crawford's daughter Sarah sits beside his wife, both beaming with quiet pride. A graph appears on screen. Average fine disparities dropping month by month as the pilot program progressed. But it's the video clips that capture everyone's attention. Crawford in his courtroom, now taking time to ensure each person feels heard, regardless of their background. Last week, Crawford continues, his voice softening. A young attorney approached me after court. She said it was the first time in her career she'd finished presenting her entire argument without being interrupted. He pauses, letting that sink in. Think about that. Really think about what it means about our system. In the front row, the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court nods slowly, her pen moving across her notepad. Behind her, representatives from 3 other state bar associations whisper among themselves, clearly impressed by the preliminary results. We're not here to shame anyone, Dr. Washington adds, her voice firm but compassionate. We're here because change is possible. Judge Crawford's courtroom has become a model not because he's perfect, but because he's willing to acknowledge his imperfections and work to improve them. Crawford clicks to the next slide, a series of quotes from court participants. "I felt like a human being," reads one. "For the first time, I believe justice was really blind," says another. Each testimony reinforces the impact of their work. But this isn't just about one judge or one courtroom. Dr. Washington continues, "We've created a reproducible model." She outlines their methodology: regular review sessions, community feedback loops, transparent reporting of demographics and outcomes. The program is comprehensive but practical, designed to create lasting change. From his spot at the podium, Crawford spots Officer Peterson in the audience, the same officer who witnessed the parking ticket incident that started it all. Peterson gives him a thumbs up, then returns to sharing the presentation materials with the junior officer beside him. As the presentation concludes, hands shoot up across the room. The questions are thoughtful, practical. How soon can we implement this? What resources are needed? How do we measure success? Crawford and Dr. Washington answer each one, their responses honed by months of real-world experience. Afterward, in the hallway, Crawford's daughter hugs him tightly. "I always knew you had it in you, Dad," she whispers. Over her shoulder, he catches Dr. Washington's eye and mouths a silent "thank you." She smiles and nods, already surrounded by judges eager to bring the program to their courts. The afternoon sun streams through the conference center's windows, casting long shadows that stretch toward future possibilities. On a table nearby, copies of their implementation guide, titled "Building Bridges: Transforming Judicial Conduct Through Conscious Change," disappear quickly into eager hands. This is just the beginning, Crawford realizes. One parking ticket, one moment of recognition, one choice to change, creating ripples that might just transform the whole system, one courtroom at a time.